Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Mike Tresca. I am the CAR-PGA committee chair. I am in my new office, so you can. This is supposed to glow, by the way, and it's broken. I don't. My brother got this. I love this thing, and every 50%, sometimes it changes colors, and I think I got it working once, and then it gave up on me. So it may be the cords down below. I'm not sure, but it's just going to have to be white for the moment. But I'm in my new office, so I've been working on this for several months. And this is my Chosky wall. So I have my little steampunk stormtrooper up there, very excited. But anyway, and my tapestry, which is actually, you can't see it. This is a map of my game world that I was able to put together. So I was quite excited about all that. But we're here to actually do, as we do, our virtual panel. We took a vacation, as you can tell, because I'm a little rusty, obviously, over the summer. We didn't meet for 2 months. Partially because we didn't get a lot of folks, and partially because everybody's busy, including myself. I was doing a lot of camping. And so we're back, which was exciting. And Chris was gracious enough to agree to this months in advance, actually, so months ago, prior to this point. And we were very excited to catch up with him. So we will talk to Chris in a moment. But before that, we have a little bit of housekeeping, and this is my favorite kind of housekeeping. A lot of times we have housekeeping that's not as fun. This is fun because Alan is actually here. So Alan White has just joined us. Welcome, Alan, and also welcome to Alex Grinton. So we got 2 new members, and your names are very close, which is freaking me out slightly between Alex and Alan. But very excited to have you both. Welcome. The CAR-PGA, one of the #1 ways we grow the CAR-PGA is really through these virtual panels. I think video is sort of the future. We recognize that. So we've really made an effort to ensure we're doing outreach in a way that's not just, hey, we send out our newsletter, which we value and is really important. We're also working on our archives. So we, Paul Caldwell, who was one of the founders of CAR-PGA, had extensive archives, and those are with Hawk Robinson, who runs RPG research. So we are in ongoing discussions to get those digitized in a way that can be leveraged. There are rules around museums, so you can't just put them on the internet, but we are working on a system where that can get up and running. So we hope to resume that. But for the interim, we are already lining up our future speakers and guests. So more to come. Welcome, Alan and Alex. Excited to have you both, and hope you'll be able to participate or even be potentially interview panelists for our next virtual panel. So always something to think about. But speaking of guests, we have Chris with us. Chris Winnan. I should have checked on this. Is it Winnan? Did I say that right, Chris?
That's right. You got it right.
Oh, well, good. So welcome, Chris. I know you had reached out to actually David Millions, I think, right? One of our board members.
Right.
In regards to one of your books. Now, it turns out you're a prolific writer, and that was the entrance, sure, one of those into how we ended up discussing gaming and education. But it turns out you've actually got quite a few books that are very interesting, certainly to me, and I think to our audience. But usually what I like to do before we get into sort of questioning and asking about the books is just talk a little bit about sort of your background and sort of how you can, I mean, certainly you've got a hobbyist bent. Gaming is obviously one of your interests. If you could tell us a little bit about sort of you, we'll start there and we'll see where the conversation takes us.
Okay, I'll give it a try. I don't do as much gaming as I would like, but I would like to tell you how I got started in gaming in the first place. I was actually very lucky. When I was still at school, when I was around about 13 or 14, it was actually my history teacher that was into D&D, and he introduced the concept to us back in those long time ago, with some after-school classes, just for a small group of maybe 4 or 5 of my classmates. And his D&D sessions, him as a DM, was really interesting, because with him being history teacher, he put lots and lots of nuance into it. And I can still remember, I mean, we're talking nearly 40 years ago, when D&D was not popular at all, and there were very few resources. I mean, there was only the handbook and the DM's guide and a few other books around, not like now when there's libraries full of material. there was hardly any figures. But because he was a history teacher, I can remember we were staying at a tavern one night in one of the adventures, and he put so much detail into it, like the fact that we were sleeping on hay pallets instead of real beds, and the fact that the innkeeper would lock everybody into their rooms at night. He put so much medieval detail into it. The real historical aspect that he put into it as a history teacher really made a big difference and really made it stand out in my mind. I don't know, these days I feel that a lot of fantasy is very much fantasy with not so much basis in historical realism. I don't know whether you guys feel that way, but I like to have my fantasy with lots of realism in it, so that I'm learning something at the same time.
Right.
Since that time, I mean, I played a bit at school, but like I say, in those days, it was a very minority hobby, and it was rather socially toxic. It's not the kind of thing that you admitted to a lot of people unless you wanted to get a good beating. And I didn't really have much chance at college, because it's not something that the cool kids were doing. And then shortly after I graduated, I went to work over the other side of the world, and up on the Tibetan plateau, there's not many people play D&D or board games or anything like that at all. But you know, I have to admit that when I did play, even after I was first introduced, I was one of those kind of solitary players. And I would always be up in my bedroom studying the GM's guide or looking through every single paragraph of the player's handbook and then writing out my own adventures. I've since learned that a lot of D&D players are actually like this.
Yes.
They'll spend more time by themselves going through the material and creating new material and putting plot lines to characters and backgrounds than actually getting together and playing. Because, you know, getting together face to face can be quite difficult. But, you know, spending time by yourself, actually studying the material and really getting into it. And, you know, it inspired me in so many ways. I did lots of reading at the same time. You know, in those days when I first started playing, I was a massive fan of Robert E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, and all these early, you know, all the pulp novelists from the, you know, of that kind of era. You know, that I went on to study English literature after that, and I'm sure that it was games like D&D that really sparked my interest in those kind of things. So, you know, I think it can be, I think gaming of any kind can be, you know, really motivational. And you know, like I say, I haven't been able to, here where I'm retired at the moment, there's not really much of a community for gaming. In fact, the nearest board game shop is 300 miles away up in Bangkok.
Wow.
And I don't know of any gamers in my particular, I live in a small beach resort, and I don't know of any gamers here. But, you know, I still had an interest in the subject. I spent quite a bit of time working in mainland China. I was lucky to work in the 90s in places like Shanghai and Shenzhen and Hong Kong. And I was able to introduce my interest of board gaming into the classes that I taught. And that was a very motivating experience as well, both for me and also for the students. So I decided that I wanted to get all my experience together and also all the experience I'd seen online and put it all together in one kind of reference book. And I think at the time, I bit off a bit more than I could chew. The book that I produced is coming on for 200,000 words, but there's a lot in this field. In fact, it was David Millions that actually inspired me to do this. I saw the original newsletters, the PDFs
Hmm.
that he created 10 years ago, and that he's been updating since. And those small PDFs, they were what inspired me to put all the information that I could find online together and hopefully produce something that was in parallel and update to that kind of thing.
That's fantastic. So it's
Sorry, I just
funny.
take a breath.
No, that's funny. It's funny you mentioned, just to go back to the realism in D&D. I've been writing a series of articles about for N. I write for N-World about camping. And my most recent one was sort of how camping has changed my perspective on what adventurers might do with camping, because first of all, modern camping is not the same as medieval camping by any means. Second, we just use literally the best technology we can get between the tents themselves, the lighting, audio, bug spray, all that stuff. But it certainly teaches you a little bit about nature. I probably went more camping in this past summer to make up for COVID, frankly, because we weren't allowed to camp or we couldn't. And I'm a scout leader. So between camping with our scouts for a week and then doing a bunch of camping on our own with my family, who was dying, we used to camp all the time. We weren't able to do it. So we did a lot of camping, way more than I normally would do. And it's really put a perspective on some of the realism that's sort of lacking from a lot of that, not just D&D, but gaming, which glosses over the, horses are like cars, camping is like being in your house. It's just like, we gloss over that stuff. And it certainly gave me a perspective. So I appreciate more than I normally would, to your point, Chris, some of the gritty realism. I don't even know if it's gritty. I think it's just probably realism. But
It
it was
doesn't have to be
fascinating.
gritty, particularly. Yeah. It's just having lots and lots of details. That's why having a history teacher was so good, because we would spend 3 hours focusing on an activity that would have taken 3 minutes.
Right.
And we would do so many things that weren't just your normal hack and slay.
Right.
I found that in other groups, it was very much a kind of, all right, well, let's get into the battle now, and we'll start rolling dice and we'll see what we can kill. And right. Yeah, in my early experience, it was much more nuanced than that. My teacher, his name was Mr. Horsley, but everybody called him Clem because he looked like Clement Freud. And so with Clem, what would happen, he was a strange kind of teacher. He looked a bit like Alan Moore. He had this big beard and he was a huge man of a guy. And he was quite, intimidating for a bunch of 13-year-old students. So he made a really good DM. But he would focus on things like how weak and defenseless some of the other characters were. Mm-hmm. And, our wizard and our thief and our cleric, they would all be very, very vulnerable characters, and they'd be very worried about, getting into fights. And we would spend a lot of the time calming down our warrior, our barbarians, and the guys that wanted to get in there and fight all the time would be petrified of doing that in case we got killed. And it was just little things like that. I mean, we would spend a lot of time with diplomacy and negotiation, and we'd be trying to subdue creatures rather than kill things outright, and seeing if we could tame things. And that a DM that has all those kind of details, that makes the game really, really interesting and rewarding, and you learn a great deal from the actual play. So I understand completely what you're talking about with camping. I mean, back in those days, the environment would have been completely different.
Right.
Even the countryside, I mean, the woods that you're going into would have been a really scary place. There would have been no roads, very few pathways. The vegetation would have been different. It would have been all these old, gnarly trees, big oak trees that were hundreds and hundreds of years old. It wouldn't be like going into a spruce plantation like you do these days, or just driving up into the wilderness in your car. It would take literally days to get there, and there'd be big game all over the place, and it'd be really scary. And those kind of details, I think, really make a good game for me.
Absolutely. And you know, to your point, the animals are different, everything's different. The lighting, we forget about light pollution. We have so much lighting everywhere, and
Yeah,
one of the
yeah, I never
things I
thought of
write
that.
about is, you know, you have to plan for not being able to see, you know, which we don't even like. Obviously, for in my case right now, I'm in the dark here, but I obviously have lighting and I'm able to do these things. You can't even do that outside very easily. I mean, you can try and do it by camplight, but
Yeah, yeah, that's
you
true.
know, campfire, it's not the same. And it was quite, it does break some habits.
People used
Wait,
to, yeah, people used to plan their activities by moonlight in the
have to.
evening. They would have to think about the lunar calendar if they were going to go on a raid or if they were going to do some surveillance or espionage. You'd have to think about whether there was going to be a full moon and, yeah, and also, you know, how you would be able to escape. You didn't really want to get caught in a full moon evening on some events, did you? You wanted
Right.
it, you know, where there was no moon at all and a nice cloudy night, so it would be actually pitch black.
Well, and I love the
Yeah,
example you
this
gave
kind of,
of the, you know, you have a teacher who obviously used that. I think that was a really great focus. I mean, clearly that was a springboard, as you mentioned, for sort of your focus on how gaming and education could work together. So, um, you know, for obvious reasons, I don't think you have to tell me, and certainly I don't think our audience is surprised by this, that, you know, education and gaming has tremendous benefits when they synchronize. You know, I'm not I have been an instructor. I've taught college classes, but the gamification specifically I got to use was really around both Cub Scouts and Scouting. So I taught the game design merit badge, which was interesting because we experiment with
oh,
different forms of gaming. And of course, I gamified our scouting badges because, you know, for the little scouts, it's you got to keep them interested. So I had some experience, but not on the level of a lot of the educators who,
yeah,
as you experienced, they're working very hard to engage kids who they are, you know, aren't just there for them, right? They're going to other classes. They've got a lot of other stuff going on. So I appreciate that. But, you know, obviously some of those experiences led to one of your books. You have a lot of the books, but you talk about board games and education. Can you talk a little bit about, sir, I think you started to mention that, like, how did you get there with board games? Was it, you said, was it David specifically with that book, or was it sort of your experience or a combination thereof?
first of all, before I launch into that, I'd like to say that I think that your experience with board game design and being able to use game design as a class, that's a fascinating subject. And maybe a bit later we can talk a bit more in detail. Because when I was involved in board games and role playing, game design really didn't exist for ordinary gamers. That was something that, you know, elite people in the industry did, not something that everybody could be involved in. And these days, I see that game design is a subject that's open to many people. There's a lot going on Board Game Geek, for example, and there's a lot of educators on there that are using game design in their classes.
Yes.
I would have never have thought. I mean, I have to make you understand that when I was using board games in education, it was like the Stone Age. It was prehistoric times, and I started off, and I'm a bit afraid to admit this in front of your audience. I was using Monopoly in English classes for English language students in mainland China. That's
Hmm.
where I actually got my start. Um, what I did was I thought, yeah, a lot of the textbooks in any form of education are deadly dull. And
Yeah.
that's no different in English language. It doesn't matter what subject you're studying. A lot of the time, the textbooks can be killers, can be absolutely terrible. So I was desperate to find something else to motivate my students. And one of the admin staff at the school that I was working for, she found herself a new client in a city in Guangzhou where I was working, which is just across the border from Hong Kong, and the company was AIA, the American Insurance Association, and they had a bunch of high-level managers, all Chinese, but they wanted to really improve their English. And I can remember the manager at my company, Dora, she'd set up the class to start at 4:30 in the afternoon on Friday afternoons. And she wanted me to go in there and teach English to a bunch of high-level managers at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon for 2 hours
Oh
and keeping them
man.
engaged. And I was really, really so angry with Dora about this, because I knew that I was going to have to work so hard to keep their attention and to keep them motivated. Anyway, so what I did was I had a small collection of board games with me that I brought with me to experiment with. And, you know, we're talking old board games that I picked up in thrift shops and secondhand stores. We're talking really old games from the 60s and the 70s. You know, I had a really old beat up Monopoly, and I had a really old Scrabble. Turns out that Scrabble doesn't work with English language students at all. Scrabble is just for native speakers. You know,
Really?
it's
Yeah.
really too difficult for students. But simpler stuff like Monopoly, you know, Monopoly gets a lot of criticism these days.
Yeah.
But with students of English language, it's great because you can practice so many functions. You know, you can practice simple functions like politeness, like please and thank you, and could you pass me the dice, and could you give me this card, and could you move my counter? And you know, there's lots and lots of simple functions that you can use. So I would always start with Monopoly, and it also gives them a lot of gaming vocabulary, because a lot of students, they haven't played games before maybe, and they don't have, you know, the understanding, the implicit understanding of the rules and how to ask for things and how to explain things and this kind of thing. So sometimes you need to start out with the basics. Anyway, it was going really well. I'd done a couple of different classes and we played a couple of games. You know, we've done Monopoly and it works really well. And then on the third or fourth class, I took in a game, a really old game that's called Mine a Million. I think it's defunct. It's an old British game. I think maybe it's called the business game, and it's a kind of like almost like a modern city builder where you have to do mining and then refining and then exporting and all this kind of thing. And I thought, you know, these are business students, this might go down well. It's a bit complicated, but I prepared really well. And I always prepare a vocabulary sheet of all the words that the students are going to need to play the game and, you know, to function properly. And my aim, especially with language students, is to introduce them and let them get on with it. Because in an English language classroom situation, what you find a lot of the time is that the teacher does 90% of the talking, which is pointless really, because the students are there to learn how to speak. And if they're not actually speaking, then it's a waste of time them being there. If it's just, you know, like now, I'm here, you know, pontificating endlessly. And that seems in a language situation, in a classroom situation, that's not the way it should be. It should be the teacher doing 10%. So I found that with board games, what I would do is I would introduce the vocabulary, show them how to play, and then just let them get on with it and let them do all the speaking in between each other. You know, I could be taking notes on if they're making any mistakes or what areas they need to improve, or if they're making any grammar errors or, you know, anything like that. But basically, I just want them to enjoy speaking the language, because they don't get a lot of chance to actually spend time really speaking it. So anyway, we got this board game going, this Mine a Million game, and you know, the 4:30 to 6:30, the first 2 hours just flew by, absolutely flew by. They were really into it. You know, they were mining all these ores and they were refining them and they were looking at building these export empires. By the time we got to 6:30, which is usually, you know, the end of the class, you know, they're completely into it. And they say to me, Chris, can we keep going? Can we keep going? And I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem, guys. You know, it's Friday evening, you know, they've got nowhere else to go. I don't have anywhere else to go. We might as well continue. You know, it gets on to 7:30. thinking, well, I wonder if they've noticed. They didn't notice at all. It gets to 8:30, they're still playing like crazy, not even looking at their watches. I mean, this is before we had mobile phones,
right.
but they hadn't, they weren't looking out the window and stuff like that. We get to 9:30. I said to them, guys, look, it's 9:30.
I gotta go.
We've been here for an extra 3 hours. It's Friday night. I want to go dancing later with my friends down at the
Yeah.
pub. I mean, we can do this another time. And they're like, well, how about can you come back over the weekend? I'm like, you have to talk to your company. I mean, it was great for me. I mean, not many teachers have that experience where the students want to stay an extra 3 or 4 hours after class. I mean, that really makes a teacher feel as though they're doing a first-class job. It makes you feel well. It was an amazing experience, and it showed the power of board games in the classroom. And honestly, that wasn't the best thing. The best thing about it, I was getting paid overtime. And it was, it was a corporate teaching job for it was a consulting gig.
Yeah,
for
it pays well, hopefully. Yeah, yeah.
Time in those days was, it was pretty good. I was getting double time. That was like $50 an hour for, sitting watching a bunch of, managers playing a board game. That was a pretty good gig in those days.
That's fantastic.
So, I was kind of limited with the amount of board games that I had. I bought a bunch with me. I can remember I was stopped at Heathrow Airport and I was charged because excess baggage because of all these board games. And I had to pay about £300 just because I had all these board games with me. I mean, they weren't super heavy, but they were big and bulky things. I hadn't learned in those days about taking them out of their boxes and 3D printing special cases and all those kind of things. So what I did was, based on that experience, I wrote to the company, to Monopoly, to Hasbro back in the UK, and I said to them, look, I'm having some good experiences teaching Monopoly, and my set is a bit battered. I've had it since I was about 4, and the dog chewed on it when I was a youngster, and all the corners are missing. And I was wondering if you could send me, a new set. And I couldn't believe it. They sent me a case of 24 boxes of Monopoly.
Wow.
To the school where I was working at. So if you are a teacher and you are interested in working, trying board games in class, don't be afraid to write to these companies, because oftentimes they will surprise you with their generosity. I mean, let's think about this. They sent a case of 24 Monopolies, a big case, all the way from England out to China. So imagine how much that must have cost them.
Yeah.
And in the library where we have all the textbooks, and they were always the first things to go. All the other teachers would take those, and I had to reprint all the materials that I had to go with them, all the vocabulary, all the function lists. I had about 20 odd lessons just for Monopoly, and they would get used all the time. In fact, I included most of that material in the book, and I hope over time people will be able to add to that. Because the schools that I worked at, the libraries were growing things. There'd be people adding materials all the time. And I obviously I don't work in China anymore. Not many people do, unfortunately. And the glory days of teaching are quite long gone. I mean, we're talking back in the 90s now, when I was in places like Shanghai and Shenzhen. But even so, I think all those lessons apply, and board games are still very, very worthwhile instruments. And if that one experience of my own can inspire some other teachers to kind of take the plunge and show them how successful a class can be, it's amazing when you see the students and they're in the zone. They're actually in the zone. Usually in an English language class, they'll all be sad and they'll be completely zoned out,
Yeah,
gawping out of the window, not paying any attention at all. Whereas in these classes where they were playing board games, they were all talking to each other in the target language.
that's
And
fantastic.
I was hardly even, I was in there and I was there to help if they needed with vocabulary and stuff like that. And I was making notes that I could, the next class I would say, this, and, this can improve and that. But really, they were so involved that they didn't watch the clock at all. And to be a teacher where you have a class and it's not a stage, it's not a case of 5 minutes before the end, all the students are putting their books away and getting ready to leave, and then they're out of the chairs as soon as the bell rings.
Right.
I didn't have those kind of classes. My classes, they didn't realize that the end was coming because they were enjoying themselves so much and
That's
they
great.
wanted to continue. That's what education should be about.
Totally. And it's funny you mentioned this because 2 days ago, I was just checking because I'd seen it, but I didn't catch exactly when. Wizards of the Coast, who currently publishes Dungeons and Dragons, released an entire curriculum for teaching D&D in classrooms, which of course has been going on with many other groups for a while now, but it's the first time, as far as I know, that Wizards of the Coast has made something specifically in the language of educators. So in other words, if you look at it, it's a learning plan. It's not sort of, here's a tool and maybe teachers go use it. It's very specifically by grade, in US grades, it looks like, and very specifically made for kids, looks like grades from 4 to 6 and 6 to 8. So that's, again, that's US grade. So clearly everybody's coming around to what I think what and what certainly I've witnessed, and I think most of the CAR-PGA gets, which is education at all levels. I mean, this is gamification, right? So for a while there, I was sort of really into gamification because that was a unification of me working at my day job and the opportunity to take a lot of the gaming skills that I'd learned and putting them together. And that's, what you're talking about absolutely is gamification, right? It's just an early version of taking fun, but hopefully productive and learning things and applying them to how people learn, because people learn better, right? The reality, as you said, Chris, in detail, people don't want to sit there and just have you talk at them. They want to play and hopefully retain through interaction. So I think that's fantastic. I do want to switch gears because I'm sensitive to time. I think you absolutely covered the gamification aspect, which was fantastic. But you're also a big fan of 3D printing. And I feel like we could probably spend an hour on that alone in the 3D printing realm. But tell me how did you become a fan? Like, how'd that happen?
Okay, I have to explain that my experience of 3D printing is very much like my experience of gaming. It's kind of prehistoric.
Mm-hmm.
I was living just across the border from Hong Kong when 3D printing hit the news, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. Some of our viewers won't be familiar with Guangzhou in China, but when they talk about China being the workshop of the world, Guangzhou is the wholesale market of the workshop. This is where all the wholesale markets are based. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of massive shopping malls, and all of these shopping malls are bigger than anything you've ever been to in America, but they're all wholesale and they're all specialized in one particular product. So there's a good 10 of these massive malls just for toys and games.
Wow.
But back in those days, I was struggling to find a 3D printer. We had to travel 2 hours outside of Guangzhou by taxi to find a guy that was actually building 3D printers, and he was building clones of MakerBots.
Mm-hmm.
I got this MakerBot clone and I took it home with me, and it was like something out of a Dickens novel. You say that you had some problems with your Dremel machines.
Yes.
This was back in the day when 3D printers barely functioned. I really had to get them going. I was quite inspired because it turns out that one of the MakerBot founders had actually moved close by to where I was in mainland China, and he was opening up a factory. As one of the, it's Bray Pettis that's the very famous guy in of MakerBot back in those days. But the guy that did a lot of the real work, the technical work, was a guy called Zach Hoken. And he was the guy that started Thingiverse, for example, and he was the guy that wrote a lot of the software. And I talked to him in Shenzhen, and I can remember being in his apartment, and he was showing me one of the first Delta printers that he actually built himself from scratch. And I saw this Delta printer going around on the floor in this. We were up on like the 40th floor in this apartment building in Shenzhen, and it felt like I was in a cyberpunk novel. It was crazy, and I was really inspired. So I went back to Guangzhou and I got my first 3D printer, and it was kind of a false start. I mean, back in the early days, this was like, not long after 2000. It must have been 2 or 3 years after that, and MakerBots in those days were a real troublesome piece of kit.
Yeah.
You couldn't really print anything decent, not like you can now. You buy an Ender or a Mars Pro, and you just plug it in and it starts going. We spent hours and hours trying to get a decent print out of that damn machine, and it used to make so much noise. It was anyway, but still, I really got into 3D printing, and I was so excited by the way it was developing all around the world, that even though I don't have a 3D printer in my apartment at the moment, I still follow carefully to see how the industry and to see how it's shaken up gaming. I mean, for a long time I was saying, oh yeah, 3D printing is really going to take over the world. And it hasn't yet, but it's taken over gaming. I mean, it's totally dominates role-playing games and board games now. The amount of gamers that have got into 3D printing is incredible. That's really where the market has completely taken off. And I'm so pleased to learn that you've got a couple of machines yourself.
Yeah, and so as a data point, I have a game. I used to do these recordings from my game room, so I have an actual office. Now we're on the first floor, but in my basement is a game room, and it has a storage tool kit. So if you've ever seen the large storage, it's a glass case. It's got probably maybe 8 to 16, if I'm trying to remember exactly how many drawers you can see inside. That was for my miniatures. So I bought that to fill it with miniatures. Okay, so that is entirely filled with miniatures. Most of them were pre-painted, so this was plastic from other places. Some of them are metal that I painted myself, and some of them are now the Reaper miniatures that Reaper produces. That's made of a special material that they produce. They call it bonesium. So that was my entire case. 3D printing made me quit collecting cold turkey. So I have not purchased any more anything. Terrain, I have Dwarven Forge, terrain, I have the Reaper miniatures. I've stopped all because of the 3D printing. Well, two things. One of them is I can print things when I need them. So the necessity of having a giant, just in case I need goblins is no longer realistic. I can have them digitally saved, and I will print them when I need them. But two, I really can't justify it anymore. It was simply put, it was like, I'd rather have a digital file and then make thousands of those when I need them than have something taking space. And it's fascinating because for me, it was pretty drastic. It was like all of a sudden my entire hobby shifted gears because I was much more interested in STL files, basically the files, and filament. But after that, I'm not buying miniatures anymore. I'm not buying. Now it's probably a good thing, but it was shocking.
It's a good thing for you, but it's not very good if you're Games Workshop or Wizard of the Coast. I mean,
how
these guys are coping, I have no idea.
That's right.
I grew up in Nottingham, which is the home base of Games Workshop. And just recently, they started opening new factories with these massive new spin injection molding machines to churn out their miniatures that cost what, $100 a piece. Who's paying for those when you can 3D print the same thing for 10 cents? I really don't understand. And unbelievably, Games Workshop is one of the most valuable companies in the UK at the moment. I mean, I know that's not saying much about, you know, the UK economy is
Right.
not up to much these days. It's a bit of a fiasco. But to
Yeah.
think that, you know, Games Workshop is worth more than, you know, big companies like ITV, like, you know, the broadcasters and some of the energy companies. For, you know, a miniatures company, who is still paying out that kind of money when there's 3D printers available? I can remember when I first started gaming, you know, there was a few companies that made lead miniatures. You had people like Raoul Partha,
Right.
and miniatures were really tough to find. Where I was at school, there was maybe one shop that sold them. And, you know, I had a miniature for my character for a cleric, and that was the only miniature I had. And I really, really treasured it. And anytime we did encounters, if we did do a bit of combat, all the other miniatures would be, you know, they wouldn't be the actual monsters. They would be, you know, like cows from a barnyard set,
Yep.
or they would be GI Joes as giants, as frost giants, because that was the only thing that we had access to at the time. And now you look at Archvillain and Bestiarium and all these designers that are producing these huge monster miniatures. In fact, you know, I was having a close look at the way the market's proceeding just yesterday in preparation for this conversation, and it seems that things are starting to flatline now. There seem to be too many designers and not enough customers, and I see that people like Archvillain and Artisan Guild, their numbers are actually dropping. And, you know, they were growing like crazy 1 or 2 years, you know, during the pandemic, their numbers were just going through the roof. And it's interesting, I don't know whether you're familiar with the company One Page Rules. They have suddenly become the top. And on Patreon, they have 10,000 followers now, 10,000 patrons, a lot more than, you know, the likes of Archvillain and people like this. And I think the reason for that is because they combine miniatures and rule sets at the same time.
Yeah.
So when you buy your STLs, you're getting like a scenario to go with them, with all of the stats for those creatures, and, you know, a game to go with it, and a storyline in the background. And I think that's really, really important. But the fact that there are so many designers, there's another 50 odd designers come online in the last year.
Wow.
And although, you know, 3D printers are selling pretty well, not everybody can afford to have, you know, to sign up to a dozen different Patreons and pay out, you know, hundreds of dollars every month. So I think we're going to see a bit of change in the marketplace quite soon. You know, I get mails from my manufacturing every day. And it used to be that they were telling me about, you know, the very latest releases. And these days, they're telling me about the latest 50% discount or the latest 80% discount. So, you know, these companies are definitely struggling. And if these designers are struggling, what about Wizards? What about Games Workshop? What the hell are they going to do? What's going on with those companies? I have no idea how they're going to survive. And like you said, you stop buying miniatures completely. How many other gamers, loyal customers, are in exactly the same boat? And how are Games Workshop? Perhaps Games Workshop is a bit different because, you know, their product line is very genre specific.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of customer loyalty. But with Wizards of the Coast, I mean, you look at some of their latest releases, a lot of their miniatures were junk. You know, the quality of the sculpts, you know, and the prices they were charging for, you know, little bitty animals that, you know, you could print for a couple of cents on your computer. You know, they really need somebody in the company to wake them up a little bit.
It's interesting you bring this up because we had Steve Jackson on, which we were thrilled to have.
I didn't realize you'd interviewed him. I will definitely.
Oh yeah, you should watch it because he talks about. So he sort of announced on that in that interview that they were going into 3D printing. And it was exactly what you said, which he basically said, look, he said, I know it's coming. And that was their next Kickstarters for first of all, it's system agnostic, right? So miniatures anyone can use, obviously. So he was re-releasing the fantasy trip. He had gotten the rights back, so he was reprinting it, and he always wanted to do that, so he was able to do it. But it was really one of those things where he fundamentally was essentially saying this was a huge opportunity to sort of get ahead of something that he knew was coming. So some folks are seeing it, but to your point, I think there's got to be a tipping point. I thought it was I for sure thought it was going to be 2 years ago, and it still hasn't happened. You'd think maybe the pandemic would have done it. That doesn't seem to have done it. To your point, it's probably going to be a quiet sort of flattening of the industry, where.
Well, if I could interrupt you for
yes, please, go ahead. Your
I
perspective
thought
on that.
Maybe the pandemic is what slowed things down. Pre-pandemic, I've noticed that games cafes were really, really taking off.
Yeah.
And there were games cafes opening up all over the place. Even here in Thailand, I was seeing games cafes open up in places like Bangkok and Chiang Mai, and they were coming up in Asia and South America, and there was loads in the States and the UK and the developed countries. And then suddenly the pandemic came along and they all closed.
Yeah.
Now, I think that pre-pandemic, a lot of games cafes were realizing that if they invested not only in a bunch of games, but in a 3D printer, then they would have people flocking to come and print off their miniatures, because they didn't really want to have an SLA printer at home, and they didn't want to be dealing with all the difficulties of the Creality, trying to get the damn thing rigged up properly and optimized. Yep. They could come into a games cafe where there would be an engineering type, and they would say, right, we want to play a game in this cafe, and we need a small army of orcs, and we need some zombies, and we need a couple of Lich Kings. Can you print those up for Thursday? Yep, no problem. That would be $28 in total, and they would still make some money because they'd be coming in and using the facilities.
Right.
And that really would have snowballed. But unfortunately, I think a lot of the games cafes closed during COVID, and that kind of thing was stifled a little bit. I reckon that a lot of games cafe owners realize that there is an opportunity in 3D printers, and perhaps we'll see it rise there. I think the other thing is perhaps maybe with educators. When I was using Boardgames in education, it was good, but Boardgames was still a bit flat. You had a board and you had some cutout cards, and it was pretty much 2D. Now, if you compare that to somebody with a 3D printer, they could print out like an army from Lord of the Rings and take it into their classroom and have it set up behind the desk, and all the students would be going, what's that? What's that? What's that? Can we play with that? Can we play with that? You'd be getting the students' interest before you'd even mentioned that you might be thinking of using a game in the classroom. They'd be looking at these miniatures and going, what's the, can we play, can we have a look at that, please? I think, I don't know. The other thing is that I was thinking about yesterday is people like yourself that have a basement full of miniatures. I think there's a lot of people around like that. I watch, do you know Gaming Geek in Chicago that does a YouTube channel? And he's got a big collection and he gets lots of freebies, but he's got loads of miniatures that he prints as well. And he's got cases behind him when he does his videos, and they're really good. And I think there's a lot of people around the country, around the world, that have big collections. Now, I was thinking that, I don't know about the US, but in the UK, public libraries are really suffering. Young people don't go to libraries for research anymore. They have Google. They don't need to go to borrow books because they have Kindles. They don't need to go and borrow cassette tapes or records or CDs because they have Spotify or they have torrents or however they get their music. Now, imagine if your collection of miniatures and scenery was available at the library and people could actually take it out and borrow it I mean, I know that it's something that you treasure, but it's something that's sitting around and not doing anything. And
Right.
teachers could go in to the library and they could say to the librarian, right, I'm doing a history class about the Peloponnesian Wars, and I need some Greek hoplites, I need some Spartans, and we're going to do some of the early conflicts. And the librarian would say, all right, open this drawer and it's full of hoplites, open this drawer and it's full of Spartans, and yeah, I've got some rules over here. You take this and you turn your history class into something really, really motivational and involving for your students.
And
I think that could be another future as well.
I actually did that. So when we did the scout training, part of so the other value, the sort of unspoken value of this is you mentioned it, is the cost, right? So it's very cheap to generate these. So what that means in a lot of ways is like I gave them away. So if you played, we would give the pieces and then we say, that's your piece now, you get to keep it. And that was a fascinating level of engagement, right? So it's like, this is my piece now. I was like, yeah, because it's your character's the ranger, he has the cloak and the bow, but he's yours. You take him home.
That's something that can't happen with Games Workshop. Because, a piece is $100.
Yeah.
You're not going to give that away. You'd rather cut your hand off than give that away.
Right.
I mean, that's insane. But when you print it for a couple of cents, then you can afford to say, yeah, you have that. And, you've got 10 followers and you've got a couple of men-at-arms. Yeah, you take all of those. That's no problem.
Right. Right. So I want to be sensitive to time, Chris. We could easily talk about. Like I said, we could easily talk. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I love your passion, Alan. I wanted to give you a chance because you're here. Did you have a question? I saw at one point, I don't know if you raised your hand or you were in agreement. Did you have a question for Chris? You can unmute if you like.
Yeah, I did. I do have a question. So he was, Chris, you were talking about the Monopoly and how the students reacted to it. Was part of it that the students they got to kind of participate directly and say, could you please give me this? Can you please? And even though they were kind of using simpler language, that was a way for them to engage and kind of be in charge for a second.
Exactly. And what I would do with Monopoly is I would tailor it for different levels. So if I had very basic students, then yes, it was just, simple please and thank you. And, can you pass me the dice and stuff like that. And yet, if I had more advanced
that was probably very rewarding.
Monopoly, then you can go to a higher level. Oh yeah, it's most students have not played a game in a classroom before, and a lot of administration, unfortunately, say, well, classrooms are not places to have fun. You shouldn't be playing games. You shouldn't be having a good time. It's a punishment. And in reality, when you look at the school system, the whole thing is a game anyway. I mean, all the students, they go around, they follow like this board game. They go from grade to grade to grade, and then they do the exams, and then they get a score, and you have a couple of winners, and you have a bunch of losers. I mean, it's all a massive game in the first place. So, why ignore that? Why not use games in the classroom anyway? Can I ask, are you a teacher yourself?
I am, yeah.
I see. And do you have any experience? Have you been able to use any board games?
I haven't used board games. I've used role-playing games.
Oh, really? What games have you used?
I've done to teach ethics. I designed a variant of using fate, the fate mechanics, because the fate mechanics with the distribution, you could kind of pretty easily put your thumb on the scales. I was deliberately trying to get them to face a challenge, but not get them to see that I was kind of loading against them and making it hard for them to succeed. And it worked really well. It was a simulation, basically creating the situation of the Chevrolet Corvair and the situation that happened because of it. So anyway,
it sounds fascinating, and it goes to show that I think any game can be adapted for the classroom. It's just the imagination of the teacher involved. In all the material that I drew together, I tried to include as much as I could, And, you know, I included things like Magic the Gathering. And people think of that, you know, as a throwaway card game. But, you know, there's a lot of Magic that's very, very educational. You know, there's like, I think there's maybe 20, 30,000 cards involved now, and they have some really, really complicated vocabulary. And students memorize thousands of them. I mean, if we could get them to memorize the textbook in the same way, then, you know, we'd really be onto something. Can I ask you, have you come across a university program called Reacting to the Past?
I'm on the board for the game development conference.
Oh, really? You know, when you talked about doing ethics, that was what popped into my mind, because, you know, the subjects that they do, you know, like the prosecution of Socrates, or the Confucian Analects. Yeah. I mean, these are really, you know, the French Revolution, and these are really, really involved subjects.
Yeah, I use their climate change in Copenhagen, where you're having you have a summit from world leaders. And speaking of China, it's really interesting because to learn to play it, I participated in it first, and I was playing China, and I'd never realized the dual problem that China faces, where they have to simultaneously bring people up, but also push them down to keep control over them. And how tough of a dance that is.
Oh, yes, you've got to continue the GDP, you've got to keep growth, you've got all those university students, 10 million a year coming out, and yet at the same time, they spend more on internal security than they do on their military budgets. So, you know, they've got to keep them, they can educate them, but they can't educate them too much. So,
and I didn't realize, and it's also neat to see, because I run that in my classes. And it's neat to see students realize the problem of, you know that something needs to be done, but the problem is, how do you get poor Micronesia, right? They're flooding, right? They're being buried underwater, and, you know, how do you, Tobago, right? What do you do about them? But then you've got, you know, Brazil and China and in developing countries that are like, well, no, you can't curtail our industry. So anyway, it's a neat conflict of ideas.
Yeah, I think that the whole Reacting to the Past project is something that more people need to know about. I've not experienced it myself, but I've read a lot about it, and hearing about how students will come from other classes and other courses, and they will like cosplay. In fact, they will dress up in period gear to really get into it. I mean, that's taking role playing to a completely new level. I think that's absolutely amazing. A lot of teachers, they're going to look down on people trying to introduce Dungeons and Dragons into the classroom, because, you know, it's fairy tales and it's, you know, it's monsters and things like that. But Reacting to the Past, that's a completely different ball game. You know, you should talk to Mike, and perhaps you could do an interview yourself on your experience, because I would be fascinated to learn much more about what happens in Reacting to the Past sessions.
Alan just got volunteered. Sorry, that's the rule. Once one guest says that the other one should do it, that's it. You automatically have to be a guest. So I'm sorry.
He may not be comfortable doing this kind of thing. He might not be a motor mouth like I am. But I think that, you know, it's definitely worthwhile somebody talking about this, because I don't know a lot of people that know about it, and it does look like a really rewarding activity. And I think it would be of a lot of interest to gamers in general, and to educators in general.
It is, yeah. Well, and also one of the conferences I was at, there were students there who were talking about it, and they got roll sheets, you know, a sheet for all of their roles. Yes. And they realized that other students were coming into students' dorms while they were away and stealing their roll sheets so they could know what their objectives were. So they made false objectives. So they created false roll sheets so that when somebody came in, they got the roll sheet, and they tricked them into doing exactly what they wanted them, what was going to behoove them and fit them. And so they were like, I think we should do this. And the students who had created the false roll sheet said, that's a terrific idea.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
But I'm like, now you've got students that are thinking like educators, right?
Right.
They're
Yes.
thinking, how do I create a false roll sheet that looks like the original one and is designed similarly anyway? So which is terrific, but also they're that deeply into the role. And it's really,
Sure.
it's really
What really impressed me is how much work they're willing to put into it. I mean, in a class like that, usually the teacher will say, right, go and read the textbook, and half the students won't read it. But if
Right.
you put it into that kind of game format, they will spend all night studying the material, trying to get an edge. They will work together, burning the candle at both ends to try and get some advantage over the competition. They you know, it really, really motivates students. I think it's a great system.
Learned more about world history working on my own campaign world, because
yes.
I'm specifically motivated to do, and I know I learned it. Like, the thing that's really just upsetting to me is I'm like, surely I went through. So as I go through with my kids, I'm constantly going, and my son is like, okay. I said, but no, this is amazing. Like, we're talking about these different cultures and all these things but I'm very specifically motivated and interested. So thank you. So Chris, this is fantastic. We could easily go for another 2 hours, and we've already drafted Alan. So if anybody else joins, we'll see what we can get else as speakers. But I love it. I think I'm so glad you took the time. I appreciate, this is not simple for you, I know, time-wise. So I appreciate you being flexible. Anything else you'd like to add? We will certainly, one of the things we do is we will absolutely link to your books. So when we put the YouTube up, we'll link to those. We'll obviously put it in the newsletter and share all that content as well. Anything else that we missed that you wanted to touch on? I as much as I'd love to touch on all the things we've touched on, I think too, we only touched on 3D printing and board games and education, but anything else we missed?
Well, you were a very gracious host. It was easy to talk to you. Like you say, I could have talked for hours on. I'm sure there are lots of more subjects we could talk about. In fact, I'm very grateful because, you know, I'm a bit isolated where I'm retired at the moment. There's not a lot of gamers and I don't get a chance to play very often. So it's good to be able to talk to like-minded people like yourself, like Alan, and be able to discuss this kind of thing and get other opinions. But yes, I have talked for too long, so I think it's probably a good place to wind it up. You're right.
Well, I'll tell you what. So one thing you for sure need to do is look up Roll20. There is no reason you can't be gaming right now if you wanted to. There's many games online that I would encourage you to look into. But Roll20 is what we use. I use this. There's two pretty big ones. Fantasy Grounds and Roll20 are the two. But they have a looking for group or looking for game. And it's not just Dungeons and Dragons, it's everything. My group is D&D because we do D&D, and you know, as adults, it's we keep skipping weekends because we have adult things, unfortunately. But
sure.
And especially in time of the pandemic, it frankly kept us all sane. And also made it more realistic. So to get together because our schedules are busy. But anyway, for sure we can talk about that as well.
I will. I'll check it out. To be honest, you know, this is the first time I've even used something like Zoom.
Yeah,
I didn't realize that my old computer would be able to handle this kind of thing. So
well, it was touch and go there for a minute, but we made
it was, wasn't it?
It was. Alan didn't see how close we came to being like, I don't think it's going to work, but it worked. So wonderful.
Yeah,
so
it worked out pretty well.
It worked out well. Chris, you've been very gracious. Thank you so much for giving your time.
It's been a lot of fun.
I love your enthusiasm, and I love that, you know, certainly you're a man with vision that I think I share it, that you look at these things and you go, does no one else see the world changing right before our eyes?
Yes.
You know, and board gaming and education and gamification in general, I would argue you got it before many people did, and 3D printing, same. I think, you know, both of those, you saw the future, and it doesn't come as quick as we always expect, but it's coming.
That's right.
And
yeah,
I think your books are definitely proof, which is great, because sometimes you can say you said that, nobody believe you. You have books proving you got it before everyone else did. So we have evidence. But for sure we will we'll put that all on the YouTube channel. We'll put it all on the newsletter. Stick around. I'll stop the recording in a minute, but thank you so much again. And thank you, of course, Alan, for you joining as well. It's great to have an audience.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Alan too. It's good to be able to finally speak to somebody that's involved in reacting to the past. That was very interesting.